Fate. Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 99-100. Chapter 99. Halloween. 3 Halloween. The Singing Pumpkin Castle. 3. The pair sat at one of the outdoor tables in the dark, staring across the street as people walked around with little regard for the two armored figures. Next to the pair sat the sack of supplies they had purchased. Foodstuff such as flour, eggs and several varieties of meat and game. "It's been a while since I was last in a place as quiet as this," Jean remarked with a small smile as she watched the crowded streets and the smiling faces. "Although perhaps not quite as loud as this, mind you," she added on. "But there is something rewarding about seeing such a sight." Ash merely hummed in response, watching the people walk around before he gave a single nod. They seemed content. "Dare I say, happy," Jean added on, giving a faint chuckle. "Have you ever seen something like this before?" "Not as such, no," Ash replied with a straight face, crossing his arms and leaning back into the wooden chair. The grand total of sane individuals did not exceed 20. Lothric was not a place for festivities, either. "So this is your first time seeing a holiday like this?" Jean surmised with a blink. "No, my second." He shook his head, although the time spent during the Festival of the Moon was relatively short. "I arrived on the invitation of Ritska and partook in a single cup of Siegbräu. Then there was the theft of many of the supplies by the moon goddess, during which myself, Ritska, Mash and Gwendolyn went out in search of them. After we returned I simply wandered Chaldea once again until the festivities were over." "Did you not think to join in again? I took it as a sign that I should be better alert," Ash remarked with a grunt, and more concerned with ensuring the safety of Chaldea than time with myself. Jean pursed her lips, tilting her head. "Does it make you happy to always have something to do?" "Happy," Ash repeated the word, pursing his lips. "I do not factor happiness into it. I am complete," he remarked, "nothing more, nothing less. I fulfill my obligations to Chaldea and Ritska as well as my greater duty is an unkindled which makes me content with my life." "Content?" Jean nodded once, turning away from the saber. "Is that all you wish to get out of existence? Is there something more to be had out of existence?" He looked at her with a raised eyebrow. "Being content with one's life should be something that all strive for. A point at which they can look at their own existence and see it as meaningful. That their purpose is being met and they can leave with no regrets at the end of their life. What of those who wish to be more than content?" Ash made an ugly frown. "There was a woman I met called Frances Drake in a previous singularity." He stared back across the street. "I wanted to kill her. Perhaps I still do." Jean blinked in surprise, not expecting such strong feelings from the man before she leaned forwards, resting her hand on the table between them. "I know of the woman?" She blinked in surprise. "I thought it would appear a great many have had their genders misremembered," Ash remarked. "That aside, she was one who pursued only her own happiness. Whether it came at the cost of another or not, with no greater sense of direction in her life than beyond fulfilling the next desire that struck her. I would not hold her as the example of all those who seek happiness beyond a duty in life." "Is that not how greed starts?" Ash asked, frowning at her. "It is the simple act of asking, could I have more? The problem is that it never stops." Perhaps Drake is the extreme example, but that is only because the issue was left alone for so long. Her greed was not quelled in its infancy and progressed further along until it reached the point of where she is now. He looked away. "A creature of habit. Is it ambition you dislike?" "Ambition? Ambition has a greater chance of causing the suffering of not just oneself, but also to those around them," he remarked. "It is not that I am naive. Perhaps duty has, in some instances, caused suffering, but those are duties that are wrong." "Wrong. A correct duty is one that leads to the benefit of others." He tapped his fingers against the table. "A farmer tends the crops which feed the people. A knight protects the people and keeps the peace. A king rules the kingdom and ensures the well-being of its people. I am not against advancement, but it should come from the duty itself, not an act of ambition." "A simple philosophy," Jean hummed in response. "And perhaps it is one that is not wrong. Dare I say, it sounds peaceful if it were realized correctly." She motioned to him. "But some of the greatest advancements have come from those who reached beyond their duty simply to see that they could Successive ambition does not justify it. Ash replied with thin lips. You would know more of this world's history than me, but how often has ambition led man down the path of suffering? Jean conceded the point with a nod of the head. You would be correct to assume that ambition has indeed led humanity down dark paths many times, and much suffering was born of that, but what you suggest is both safe and constricting. Constricting? How might humanity progress if they do not take risks? You would ask me to choose between the chance humans would be bettered or the chance they would suffer. Having seen humanity suffer as a result of ambition, I cannot condone any choice that results in the latter. His eyes narrowed. I will not. There will inevitably come a point where humans suffer too greatly as a result of such a thing, at which point, the only option remaining to them is simple mercy. Mercy? The removal of that which brings their suffering. Ash stated, looking away from her, in whatever form it takes. And at what point is it decided that humanity has suffered too much? When beings like me return. He nodded at Jean, and yourself. Humanity is dead, so we have been called upon to return them. That is the duty we have all been entrusted with. Jean remained silent, giving a single nod of the head as she processed her words. There are some that say suffering exists to test our faith in God, in reminder that after we die there is a reward for our struggles in life. Ash stared at her out of the corner of his eye. And how long does one have to suffer before they can endure no more? When they are cursed like me? When they are dragged from their grave? At what point is it decided that they have struggled enough and are allowed this reward that you speak of? I cannot say. Jean shrugged. Everyone endures their own struggles in life. Some tests of faith are greater than others. What matters is that we remain true to our faith, in God and to ourselves. A life that is justified in the idea that, at the end of suffering, there is the chance for betterment is not one I can agree with. Ash remarked, in my knowledge, such betterment is fleeting and the suffering is to return. It does not return in his kingdom. Jean remarked before she paused, however, I cannot make the claim that I understand all there is to know of the faith. Heaven is the kingdom of salvation where all souls find peace. I imagine Gwyn said much the same. Ash remarked, the kingdom of peace, and Gwendolyn, and those of the ringed city. I do not trust the words of most Lordkin. Most. I am confident in the teachings of the Sunlight Covenant. Ash replied, we are summoned to aid those who call upon us when they are in times of crisis against whatever threat faces them. The conditions for our summonings are either that of Darkwraith invasions of creatures of strong power. He looked at her, as I am sure you are confident in the teachings of your own Lordkin. I am. Jean replied with a determined look in her eyes before she smiled, so your role in this covenant is to aid those when they are in danger? Giving an approving hum, she tilted her head? Or rather just cause. Wait, your patron, were they not? Yes. Ash pursed his lips, he claimed to have no ill will against me as a result, but the fact remains that I did slay him. He paused, although he was near Hollow at the time, therefore perhaps it was my duty to end his life as an act of mercy. I suppose it might be viewed as that. Jean admitted with a shrug. Did he accept this mercy? He made no complaints about it. Then it would seem there is nothing to forgive. She paused. If I might ask you a question, why do you find duty so important? Ash hummed in response. Do you know what an unkindled is? I do not. Ash grunted in response. We are those who attempted to link the fire and were found unworthy, burning away into ash and scattered to the wind. Is that how you died? No, that was how I was born, he remarked, eyes darkening and lip curling as he stared up at the sky. When the flame begins to die, it requires a champion of great notability to link it once again. I was found unworthy for whatever reason, perhaps I was too weak or perhaps my soul was unremarkable. It matters not, if a champion is not found, then the flame will call out to the souls of those who had linked it in the past. Lords of Cinder. Jean blinked. Remembering the term, Sullivan called me a Lord of Cinder in name. I imagine he would. Ash shrugged. You become a lord in much the same way, a sacrifice for the world. You burn in the kiln for eternity until your soul is consumed, leaving behind simple scraps. He shook his head. That is how one becomes a Lord of Cinder. They are legends who had the strength to light the flame and keep the age of fire moving onwards. He paused. I understand it is called the Age of Gods in this world. A sacrifice for the Age of Gods, Jean muttered to herself, frowning. How long did such a thing happen? That is not known to me, or anyone I suspect. Ash remarked. Gale was a human in the first Age of Fire and he said he stopped counting his age long ago. He looked back down at her. As I was saying, if, for whatever reason, the Lords of Cinder do not light the flame, then we are called upon, the unkindled. Those who failed to achieve that which we strove to do. Jean pursed her lips. I see. Thus we unkindled are sent out at the end of fire to return the lords to their thrones and link the flame. He replied, then paused as he stared back out across the street with a distant look in his eyes. It is a strange thing to consider. When first I heard the lords had absconded from their thrones, I viewed them as traitors. Those who abandoned their one duty, their one reason they were brought back, and why failures like myself were relied upon. He looked down at his hands, and yet now, I understand their motivations perfectly. An act that I agree with. You agree with? Jean parroted with confusion. I do not. As an unkindled, my firekeeper told me my role in the world was to end the suffering of man. His hands clenched. Duty is important to me because it is me. I am nothing but my duty, to humanity and to myself. Jean remained silent for a few moments. I am not one to tell you that way of life is wrong. I dedicated myself to a similar duty to bring peace to France and to the Lord. She replied eventually, if that is the manner of life that you feel is most comfortable to you, then I cannot dissuade you of the notion, but there are other manners in which one might enjoy life. She nodded back down the street. This display of joy does not come from a duty, and yet they enjoy it all the same. Ash remained silent, looking at Jean out of the corner of his eye. If I found peace even in my way of life in duty, then why should the same not be true for others? He turned to her. All of those I have seen live for their duty have found peace, and those who turned away found only pain. So why should I not consider that a life of duty is the only manner of life which matters? People are unique, different from one another. It is what makes each individual soul special. What brings joys to one might bring sadness to another, and what brings meaning to one life might not to another. Jean shrugged. Perhaps some lives are destined for great meaning and perhaps some are not. Some have their purpose revealed to them and some spend years searching for theirs. The question you must ask is that if the only purpose of life is duty, or if there is something more to a person. The only purpose of life is duty. Ash stated with absolute confidence. With a clear understanding of one's place in the world, they avoid a sense of loss, of hollowing. They understand who they are and what they are in the grand scheme of things. And if they do not agree with their duty, she gestured to him. Did you not agree with those who abandoned the duty you yourself were risen to complete? It was a duty not for me, Ash replied, and even still, I took it upon myself to alter the purpose of my existence. To bring about the lighting of the flame once again would be to prolong the undead curse and the age of fire, to prolong the suffering of humanity. Thus I took it upon myself to grant humanity the only mercy I was capable of giving them. Jean pursed her lips at the odd wording. Her brows furrowed ever so slightly. I bet that just burns you up so far. The pair jolted at the sudden voice, turning to see Patches in the chair behind them, lacking his usual smile. Doesn't it, cleric? He aimed the words at Jean, the woman sighing in response before turning her attention to the man. Is there some issue you have with me? Just clerics. You aren't all that special. Patches dismissed with a wave of his hand before nodding his head towards Ash. Assume you were trying to convince him of some worship. Try and change his thinking so it can all go your way. How lovely that would be. Quite the contrary, I was engaged in a simple discussion to understand him. Were you now? Patches scoffed, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. How noble of the cleric to lower herself to talking with a simple unkindled. Shifting his expression to Ash, he gave the saber a half smile. You must feel very blessed. Is there something I can help you with, Patches? Ash turned to him with a raised eyebrow. Or did you come simply to ease boredom? I thought I might speak with an old friend. Patches pressed a hand against his chest in mock hurt. And I'm saddened you'd think otherwise. Ash raised a single eyebrow at him in disbelief. All right. Patches chuckled, leaning forwards. At least you're a little less gullible than last time. You're learning after all. I'm almost proud. Been a while since we met, so I thought I might as well see how you were doing. Patches remarked. Last time we spoke was in that old city of the gods. His lip curled into an ugly smile. What a horrible place that was. He nodded at Jean. Paradise. A snort. Jean gave him a flat look before she turned away from him. Is there a reason you dislike the church so much? Because you're all so self-righteous. Patches rolled his eyes at her. Pray to such and maybe your life will get back on track. Do this and you'll be a good person because we said so. Honestly, and then behind closed doors you'll do the complete opposite of everything you preach about. You have a cynical view of the church. I have a realistic view on clerics. Patches dismissed. You're all alike, every last one of you. Looking down on the little man trying to live his life. You seem to be some of the worst of the sort. Gullible enough to see the good in everyone and just accept it as a path of the gods when something goes wrong. He turned to Ash. So, I am a little curious now. How do I fit into your sense of duty, Do I suffer enough to deserve mercy? Ash stared at him. Not yet. He simply remarked. Despite having no sense of duty, you have no sense of greed or ambition. You are neutral. Neutral, Fair enough. Patches smirked, leaning back. So, not yet. Blimey. That's a very kind way of letting me know the headsman's axe is poised over my head. At least you're honest about it though. Still a bit simple, but honest. He paused, thinning his lips, shamed to hear about the old rat. Ash stilled. Jean noticed the way his eyes froze over before they narrowed slightly. Really, honest. Patches nodded. He was one of my best customers, so he was. Also one of my best suppliers for goods and all. Been a thief a long time and I knew him a long time. Don't quite know what you brought out in him but hadn't seen him quite so spry in years. He shrugged. Well, such is the way of life I suppose. Everyone eventually runs their course. Even you, maybe, one day. Patches tapped his nose. But not today, friend. He stood back up. Well, I'll be by my boutique of wonders when you are ready to purchase something. He gave Jean one final scowl before he turned away and walked back the way he came. A rather strange character. Jean remarked after a few moments. Patches lives for his own sake. Ash replied. He dislikes the clergy though. I gathered. It would seem he had rather poor encounters with them. She thinned her lips. I assume that might have colored his perception. He's older than me. I assume he's seen much in the world. Ash pointed out. Not that it is difficult to be older than me. Why, how old are you? Several months. That is rather young, isn't it? She stared at him, frowning as her true name discernment failed to accurately identify the saber. Presumably because Ash was not a true name but merely one he identified with. There were fragments but they were foggy, as if there was something hindering her ability to accurately see his legend. So I've been told. Left side mash. Ritska called out, gesturing in the direction of the pumpkin-headed skeleton. Because that was actually a thing now, apparently, and alerting the shielder to the danger. Mash swung herself around and raised her shield just as the arrow was loosened, the projectile bouncing off with a dull thud as it struck the center of the cross-shaped shield. A flash of light went off behind Ritska, the boy hunching himself down as he felt the heat build up before several orbs of blue flame raced past him and struck the skeleton in the center, the body shattering into a pile of bones and causing the pumpkin head to hit the ground with a rather weighty thud before it rolled away. Sigurd gave a grunt of effort shortly before he decapitated another skeleton and caused the body to fall to the ground in a pile of bones, the pumpkin landing atop it and flickering out. The light, quite literally, leaving its eyes. I have seen many strange things during my travels. Sigurd spoke slowly as he continued to stare down at the pumpkin head before craning his head to face the other three. But I will admit, this is a first for me. A first for me too. Ritska honestly replied, placing his hands on his hips and staring at the remains closest to me. Rather comical, isn't it? Quite. Sigurd chuckled, resting his greatsword on his shoulder and tapping on the side of his helmet with his left hand. It makes me a little uneasy that someone might mistake me for one of these odd things and accidentally strike me. His chuckle turned slightly nervous towards the end of his sentence. Don't worry, Sigurd-san. Mash reassured him with a wide smile. You're a much bigger presence than the skeletons. Are you saying I'm fat? Mash froze, her eyes going wide in alarm before she raised her free hand in a panicked motion. And no, I mean that you held a bigger magical presence. Peeved. Sigurd snorted, shaking his head and waving his hand. Don't worry too much, girl. I'm not one to take offense to such harmless gestures. He motioned to the skeleton pile with a nod of his head. Besides, I might be undead, but there's a fair bit more meat on my bones than this one. So, how do skeletons work where you guys are from anyway? Ritska found himself asking, tilting his head, because Ash said he'd fought them before, but undead don't, you know. Ah, necromancy. Sigurd explained easily, or long lingering curses. Not undead in the traditional sense, but still undead. He paused, cupping his helmet chin. Think of them as created purposefully. He paused again. Well, I haven't heard of an undead being around long enough to become a skeleton. I wonder if that's ever happened. Right, Ritska replied slowly before he turned to the other compatriot they had. How are you doing, Kiyohi? Wonderful, Enshin-sama. Kiyohime replied back before he could even finish, smiling widely at the boy before she paused for a moment, looking a bit hesitant. While this isn't quite where I would prefer to spend time with you on a romantic outing, I am happy to be with you no matter what we are doing. Her eyes drifted to Mash and Sigurd. Although I would prefer to be alone, she muttered. I mean, a literal haunted forest in the dead of night isn't where I would want to take someone either. Ritska admitted with a shrug. Maybe a park or something? Like a picnic, senpai? Mash turned towards him. That sounds fun. Yeah, something casual. Ritska replied. Wouldn't even need to be romantic. Just a casual outing with friends would be nice enough. He turned to Sigurd, missing the intrigued look on Kiyohime's face. What about you, Sigurd, if we aren't being too rude in asking? Me? Sigurd paused. Well, I never, he paused, stuttering as he tried to find a sentence. I wouldn't think to well, I never really was involved in that sort of thing. Me neither, to be fair. Ritska replied, putting the man at ease slightly. I just never had the time for romance. My brother. Oh yes. Sigurd chuckled to himself. Old Siegbert was quite the, he was rather popular with the women. Became something of a legend in Annaberg actually. There was this one story that stuck around where the farmer caught Bert and his daughter. He cut himself off, suddenly becoming aware of his actual audience. Better not tell that one. He decided to himself, Boudica would be quite unhappy if I did. He sounds adulterous, Kiyohime remarked disapprovingly. Actually, he was rather faithful to his wife, when they did get married. Sigurd remarked, noting her surprise. Indeed, a rather strange turnabout for all of us as well. Then again, having met Isolde, many would say that cheating on her would have been a rather stupid move. Quite. Sigurd nodded. Anyway, Bert met her at one of the festivals, made the mistake of challenging her to a drinking competition. He paused. Well, he thought it was a good idea at the time, but he didn't know she came from Flushsunge. He saw their looks of confusion, a town famous for its production of very strong alcohol. Not quite as strong as Siegbräu. Sigurd added on proudly. Ritska snorted. I imagine that went well. It did, for the first 10 drinks. Sigurd chuckled. By the end of it, Siegbert was flat on his face and Isolde had forgotten what she was there for and kept drinking. Then they were both out. After that, well, Siegbert was smitten with her. What an odd way of meeting. Not quite the romantic fairy tale, I admit. Sigurd replied with a wry chuckle. But they were happy enough. 20 or so years they were married, might have been more. I caught the curse and had to leave. I assume they were still married though. He paused. I like to think so at least. Sounds nice. Ritska replied to him as they resumed their walk through the forest. It was. Sigurd admitted. As for your original point, a picnic in the open, I suppose there might be some appeal. What would you do with your beloved? Kiyohime asked Sigurd with sudden interest, staring at him out of the corner of her eye. Rather late for such a thing now, Sigurd said after a moment of silence before he shrugged. But I suppose if I were to begin courting someone, it would begin with a trip around the town, finding all the sights worth seeing and then a meal made by me to end the evening before we each went home. Kiyohime gave a nod after a few moments. That sounds rather simple and yet casual for a first date. She replied to him, although it is heavily based upon the location the date takes place in, but I can suppose you would be limited in choices. She continued on, flashing her fan open and giving a thoughtful hum. However, a first date should be casual as you have only just begun courting and you should begin to get to know your partner. Sigurd furrowed his brows at her. Would it be rude of me to ask why? If that is the case, you're so close with young Ritsuka. Kiyohime giggled at him. Silly, Master Sama is different because he is Anshin Sama. We are merely picking up where we left off. I see, Sigurd replied. The truth was that he really didn't. Although from the looks of things, neither did Ritsuka or Mash. The former stared at the berserker with mild confusion and a hint of worry while the latter looked utterly dumbfounded. But there is certainly promise in your first date. Kiyohime pointed the fan at Sigurd. Although you have much to learn about the heart of a maiden, I'm sure you will one day find your own Anshin Sama. She paused before frowning. Not my Anshin Sama though. Because I will burn you if you attempt to take him. The thought hadn't entered my mind. Good, Kiyohime beamed, retracting the fan. Then I am thankful for this honesty and support. More skeletons, up ahead. Ritsuka suddenly called out. The berserker snapped her attention to the direction of the shout before she growled and marched forwards, waving her fan open and unleashing several orbs of fire towards the direction of the rattling bones. She had tried to limit the amount of destruction she could unleash with her flames. The ease at which she might be able to set this forest ablaze was certainly a danger. Worse if she managed to get Master caught up in the inferno. It was one of those odd situations where having a third and fourth wheel actually benefited her. How long have we been here, Roman? Ritsuka asked as he watched the fight take place in front of him. Because I get the feeling we're almost out of mash. Right side. A cry followed by a shattering of bones echoed through the forest. Because I get the feeling we're almost done with our patrol. You've been there for about 30 minutes. Romani's voice came back through the radio. So halfway, although there's nothing to stop you from leaving early. Nah. Ritsuka shook his head. I'd feel a bit guilty if I only called Jean down to fight while we all sat in a town and did nothing but eat food and buy wool. He paused. Also, I think Ash could do with spending time in an actual town. He didn't really go out all that much in Rome. He paused. Then again, we weren't there. Low Sigurd, wind tunneled towards the archers' center. A veritable storm of wind howled through the woods, tearing branches from the trees and sending the volley of arrows that had been flying towards them scattering into the distance. Weren't there long, he completed his sentence as he carried on behind the trio, making sure to stick close enough to Mash so that she could protect him but not too close as to get in her way. Just think it would do him a bit of good to see something approaching normalcy. Given his life before now, I'd say a peaceful town is as far from normalcy to him as it gets. Romani bluntly replied before he sighed. But that's your choice, I suppose. He's actually been speaking with Jean a fair bit. I'd say they get on, all right. Really, that's good to hear. Ritsuka allowed himself a half smile before it vanished. Although I heard something from Arash that he doesn't consider anyone his friend. I think it's just a case of only considering one person a friend. Romani corrected him. I can't make a comment on that though. He seems rather sensitive on the topic of friendship. Just don't eavesdrop on anything too personal. Ritsuka pointed out, for privacy's sake. Alright. You've already done it, haven't you? In my defense, it's Chaldea policy to keep this line active at all times in case of capture. Romani rattled off mechanically. I mean, I might not like it at times, but if it keeps you alive then I can live with myself. Ritsuka hummed in response before shaking his head. Alright then. I'll remember that in future. For the meantime we'll finish up our patrol around here, Kiyohime. Yes, Anshin-sama. The girl cheerily replied before Ritsuka's form was illuminated by a sudden burst of flame off to the side. Ah. Sigurd, can you try and put that tree out? So how was the town? Ritsuka asked as he approached the sitting duo, the others following behind him with varied looks of intrigue on their faces. Jean made to reply first as Ritsuka approached before she paused, noticing the flakes of soot in their hair and on their faces. Master? What happened to you? Ash looked similarly concerned at this point. Just a small forest fire. Ritsuka replied with a wave of his hand. Kiyohime flinched and looked off to the side. Nothing too bad. We were able to put it out quickly. Then, what happened to your hair? Ash asked, gesturing to their appearance. Well, it turns out that using hurricane force winds does indeed suddenly put a fire out by sucking away all the oxygen. Ritsuka replied dutifully, the problem is that the winds have a nasty habit of blowing up whatever they hit. Which in this case was the burning tree, so we all managed to catch a face full of smoke. I see. That's good because for about a minute, we couldn't. Ritsuka joked to himself, earning a snort from Sigward and nothing else. The smile on his lips died at the rather cold reception before shaking his head. Anyway, how did you find your trip around the town? Jean rose from her seated position with a causal smile. It was informative, she replied, giving Ash a side-eyed look. We were also able to procure the items on the list. She gestured to the small bag at Ash's side. Ritsuka gave her a grateful smile. Thanks. Roman wasn't too awkward, was he? He didn't say what happened. Roman did fine. Ash replied with a nod of the head. His aid was appreciated. That's good to hear. Ritsuka replied, placing a hand in his pocket as he turned to Jean. Thanks again for stopping by to help. You are my master. Jean replied with a wry smile, and it was nice to be in a place such as this during a time of festivity. Perhaps as a reminder of what we seek to save. She paused before scratching her cheek and looking away, and I haven't been to something like this before. Ritsuka snorted, I'm glad you enjoyed yourself. Raising up his left arm, he stared at the communicator. You still there, Roman? I'm here, Fujimaru-kun. I'll prepare for the return of Jean and the supplies that she and Ash purchased. The man paused. I take it that after this you'll be continuing your investigation of the Singularity. First we're gonna go to Patches and see what he has for us. Ritsuka replied, I'm now curious what we can actually buy for some Halloween decorations and whether it was actually worth it. Whether or not you get good stuff out of it aside, you still helped in clearing away spirits and a demon on the outskirts of a town. Romani replied, that sort of stuff is really quite dangerous for the locals and someone would have gotten hurt eventually. Huh, you're right. Ritsuka admitted, looking at Mash, how weird. Indeed, Senpei. Mash nodded her head with a serious expression. It is strange that Dr. Roman spoke common sense. Ah, back to the old routine are we? Roman grumbled but didn't sound too irritated. Indeed he sounded more amused at being verbally attacked in such a way. Glad to see you're all still in high spirits. Are you making some sort of pun? What? Romani paused before a groan came over the communicator. No, I didn't mean it like that. Shame. Ritsuka sighed. Anyway, he looked back at Jean, thanks for stopping by. The pleasure was mine. Feel free to call upon me again if you ever have need of me. She paused. I suppose I will also have to tell Marie about this. She realized, she likes gossip. I'm going to contain my surprise. Ritsuka replied with an utterly straight face before his lip twitched upwards with concealed laughter, much to the amusement of the saint who rolled her eyes in exasperation at him. Alright, Fujimaru-kun. Romani pressed on the communication button. We'll await Jean's arrival shortly. Unpressing the button, he leaned back into his chair and stared straight ahead. The simple fact was that the communication devices were always operational, no matter how many were active within the Singularity at any given time. It was a rather recent addition, but it was a new directive in the event of capture or other such scenarios where Chaldea needed to be aware of the growing situation. However, the problem was that in cases such as these it unfortunately meant they were eavesdropping on rather private conversations. Romani's eyes drifted towards Ash's readings on the screen, staring at them. Nothing but duty, huh? The man muttered to himself, pursing his lips. That was depressingly familiar, and not just in the way that Ash waited for a command before he himself did anything. There were differences of course, but the simple fact was that Ash hadn't experienced what being human actually was. Or maybe he had, and this was the conclusion he had reached. Except it wasn't as much a conclusion as it was simply being pulled from one direction to another and going with the flow without further consideration. He sighed, shaking his head and looking away. He wasn't going to pry into that though, least of all because it wasn't his place to dictate to people how to live their lives when he himself barely had any experience in living like a normal human. He also very much doubted that Ash would learn to appreciate Magi*Mari in the same way that he did. For the time being, he'd leave it up to Fujimaru as to whether or not there was going to be an offer of help. No sense in him causing strife where none existed. His eyes drifted past the screens and to the ray-shift chamber itself where Jean and the supplies returned from the Singularity. Putting on a smile once again, Romani turned back to the screen and pressed the intercom. He was going to do what he did best and just support everyone. Successful ray-shift of Jeanne d'Arc and the supplies. Romani's voice came back through the communicator. Onto Patches now, aren't we? He paused. So, can we ask him how he was able to move between singularities? Because that seemed a little odd to me. I doubt we would receive an answer. Ash remarked with a shrug before he paused to consider something, and the answer would likely be summoning stones. Although how he would be able to summon himself is beyond me. Then again, Patches had a variety of items and speaks of things and places I have never seen before, so I assume he has a great many trinkets I know nothing of. So the answer is, he did a thing, yes. Okay. Romani popped his cheeks. Trading Halloween decorations for supplies though, that's a little strange. I am not sure, Doctor. Mash suddenly remarked, cupping her chin in thought. Maybe they hold some manner of enhancement or quality to them. They did originate in a singularity and are made from materials that will not appear in history for another 300 years. I didn't think of it like that. Romani remarked with sudden realization, although the scans here aren't saying there's anything odd about them in any manner. Unless, I suppose they could be broken down into quartz. Saint Quartz? Ritska raised an eyebrow and voiced back in surprise. No, quartz points. Romani replied with a wave of his hand. That sort of thing is more Leo's speed, but from what she told me they were used as fuel thus far, mainly for improving the servant containers. I can do that? Oh, right. No one told you? Romani quietly replied, tapping his fingers against his desk. Yeah, you can. We're still looking into it now, but it looks as though the cost of summoning servants with the Fate system means their containers are slightly weaker than they would be otherwise. Not your fault, it's just how it is. Leo suspects they can be improved by utilizing some of the resources we've collected thus far. Bones and that. Ritska furrowed his brows, so upgrade materials. Yes. The master blinked once and then looked around. Would it be weird to point out this feels like some manner of mechanic from a game? No, it pretty much is. Romani replied with a shrug, doesn't change much though. Right. Ritska sniffed, that's gonna be weird from now on. Patches looked over their assorted currency with a critical eye, picking up one or two of the items and humming to himself before setting them down. The man looked between the currency on the table and the group several times before he gave a single nod of the head. All right then. He smiled and spread his arms wide in greeting. Welcome to Patch's Boutique of Wonders. What can I interest you in? What do you have? An excellent question. Patches grinned, snapping his fingers before seemingly pulling a box from nowhere and placing it on the counter of his stall. Flipping the lid open, he reached into it much further than one would normally expect from the small box before he pulled out a hand-sized golden jewel, star-shaped with 6 points on it. I have around 100 of these and would be more than willing to give them to you for the right price. Okay, I mean it's a pretty nice jewel, but what the heck? Romani blurted out in shock, staring at the readings. That's what? Patch's smile seemed to widen. I can see you understand their value, strange man. He chuckled to himself as he flipped the jewel through the air before catching it again. Indeed. Handy little things that serve the same purpose as something you're familiar with. Nodding towards Ash and earning a raised eyebrow from the man, Patches sighed. Souls. Ash stared at the jewel with newfound interest. They grant strength? Indeed they do. Patches grinned. These ones are some of the finest around. He placed the star back in the box. And all for a fair-ish price. He raised his hand. But, before you decide on that, I do have a few other trinkets that might be of use to you. He reached back into the box and pulled out a familiar bottle. Blessings from a certain goddess. Rather tasteless water, but it's got a good trick to it. Divine blessings. Ritska cupped his chin. then furrowed his brow. It's blue? I thought they were golden? Those that bring health do. Patches admitted, shaking the bottle in his hand. This one restores magical energy. You can do that. It normally requires a ritual. Romani began only for Ritska to shiver at the memory of the talk Da Vinci gave him, or the consumption of a soul. There are different ways of restoring magical energy, but most are quite lengthy or a bit gruesome. Well, you can forget about eating souls for a start. Patches snorted. This little bottle restores all the magic you need. Single use only, of course. Naturally, Ash remarked, looking at Ritska. He speaks truthfully. The divine blessings for magical energy restored me no matter how depleted I was. Sounds like some blessing via an authority. Romani stated, also useful. Very useful. Glad you agree. Patches chuckled, going back into the box. I've got some other items for you, aha. He pulled out a stone, looking more crystalline with a glowing center, healing stones. Very popular about, a while ago. He shrugged, works for undead and humans. Simply crush the crystal and let the spell heal you up. Useful if you haven't got any Estus or healing on hand. Huh, this is surprisingly useful. Ritska remarked with a pleasant tone before he gave Patches a suspicious glance. What's the catch? Catch? I'm a fair businessman. Patches frowned back. I'd never try to scam my customers. Liar. Kiyohime hissed from behind Ritska, earning a flat look from the man before he rolled his eyes. All right. I suppose, if you can't turn a blind eye to the less than reputable methods I used. He remarked before raising his hands, but I never killed anyone and I'm no thief. You put them in a position to die and looted their bodies, didn't you? Ash asked with an expectant look. Patches nodded once. Well, most of the time. Some of these I acquired in fair trades too. You know what? Ritska placed his hands on his hips. How about I don't ask where you got the stuff from and you don't tell me, sound good? Patches grinned, sounds excellent. Now then, I've got some more items for you to look at. Some bones from skeletons, dragon teeth and other little assorted items. He explained away, resting both his hands on the stall counter and leaning forwards. So, what can I interest you in today? Remember, we're open as long as the singularity is. He paused. Oh, if you happen to die. Do make sure it's somewhere accessible. I'll make sure to put all your belongings to good use. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Ritska flatly responded. Patches gave a wide smile at the group as he closed his eyes. My pleasure. Psst. Fujimaru-kun. I think this is a really suspicious person. Romani whispered to the boy through the communicator. The attempt at subtlety was lost by the simple fact that his voice was amplified through the speaker, meaning that everyone around the group could hear the doctor just fine. No kidding, Roman. Talk about pricey. Ritska grumbled to himself as they continued their trek towards the castle. Rolling his arms. I don't think we'd have been able to buy all that much even if we budgeted. Patches said he will remain for as long as the singularity remains open. Ash replied, which he is usually truthful about. He said he would remain. Kiyohime scowled. He did not mention what his intentions would be, either as a vendor or a villain. That is typically the chance one takes when dealing with Patches. A chance no one should take. The berserker gave a light growl in response, looking straight ahead as they continued their walk up the simple path out of the town. I cannot stand liars, and that man reeks of falsehoods and half-truths. That aside, do you think we have to watch out for him, Ash-san? Mash asked, the only one with experience with the man. Ash gave a single nod. As I have said when dealing with Patches, avoid areas with long drops. He paused. Or locations which only have one entrance. Fortunately, the summoning renders the latter option useless. Unless you get trapped in a location with a high level of interference. Romani, helpfully, added, such things will mess with the rayshift. I'm beginning to think that between dropping us from the sky and leaving us trapped in cave-ins, that the rayshift technology is secretly trying to kill us. Ritska voiced aloud with a small frown. It's just some minor issues. Romani argued back defensively. You got here in one piece, right? I suppose. Ritska admitted with a shrug. Still, those are some pretty major minor issues. Fair enough. Romani shrugged, so original point to add. Watch out for Patches, he might help you but he might also leave you to die. He paused, we'll put him down as neutral third party for the moment. I don't understand. Mash shook her head, should Patches-san not also be against the incineration of humanity? If he was a heroic spirit of this world, I would agree with you. Romani nodded his head, however, he isn't and is somehow able to move between singularities. There's nothing to suggest that he is actually dead to begin with and hasn't simply hijacked the summoning system to manifest himself. Wait, you can do that? Ritsuka blurted out in surprise. I thought you had to be dead first? Romani paused, eyes going wide, ear mmm. Maybe. He shrugged before shaking his head, we're dealing with another world here. We've already encountered multiple entities that theoretically shouldn't be summonable to begin with. Namely gods and 2-5. Who knows what other kinds of exceptions can be made. Ritsuka raised both his brows, pausing before giving a single grunt of understanding. Didn't consider that. So Patches might be alive and just summoning himself. He frowned. That still seems a bit strange to me. We're dealing with people wandering across from another world like it's nothing and it turns out most of them are zombies. What isn't strange about this recently? Ritsuka gave the man a frown, soon followed by Mash. What? Wait, sorry, guys. Romani hastily apologized, didn't mean to offend. Zombies are humans who have been brought back from the dead. Are they not? Ash asked with a raised eyebrow. Strictly speaking, I am a zombie. As am I, Sigward remarked. Zombie. He repeated the word to himself. What an odd title. Be that as it may, I'm not calling you zombies. Ritsuka dismissed, far too many negative connotations with that. If you say so. Ash shrugged to him. The group eventually reached the end of the path, finding themselves at the large iron gate of the castle in question. The group stared at the entrance before they looked around. So, do we knock or just shout up? Ritsuka asked, placing one hand on his hips and using the other to scratch the back of his head in confusion, because the invite didn't specify. I suppose we do what all good guests do. Sigward chuckled, fearlessly walking towards the gate without looking back. We knock, of course. Oh ho 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 ho. Hey, wait a second, Sigward-san. Mash called out after him. We don't know if there are any traps or... Hello. Sigward shouted out in a jolly tone as he pounded his fist against the gate. I am Sigward of Katarina. I'm here with Ash, Mash, Kiyohime and Master Ritsuka. We were invited to stay at a location like this. He called out again, have we gotten the right location or are we lost? He stepped back, letting silence fill the night. Sigward paused, humming to himself and scratching his helmet. I wonder if they heard me. Perhaps I should cry out louder? Before anyone else could speak, the gates started to groan as the bars slowly raised themselves upwards, granting entry into the courtyard of the palace walls. Aha! Sigward let out a jubilant cry, turning around to face the others. We are in the right location. Okay. Ritsuka blinked in surprise. Note to self. Peaceful option is a genuine option. He turned to Mash and smiled. I'm quite pleased with that. Mash gave a nod back in response before they all walked forwards, passing underneath the gate arch and into a rather spacious interior. The only visible building was that of the citadel on the opposite end with a singular iron door leading into it. Rather straightforward, isn't it? Ritsuka asked as he scratched his chin before he shrugged. Well, best get going. Wait, senpai. Mash lightly grabbed his shoulder to stop him moving before she protectively moved in front of him. I sense another servant nearby. Kiyohime stilled, her eyes going wide. I sense a wicked woman approaching. She hissed, moving in front of Ritsuka as well. Stay back, Anshin-sama. La la la, a melodious voice echoed out as a form gradually solidified. A young Caucasian woman came into being. Long brunette hair freely flowed outwards with large orange flowers pinned into either side just above her ears. The woman span on the spot, dancing gracefully as she moved closer towards the group, finishing off with a spin before she gave a light bow and looked up. Silver-colored eyes stared back at the group with curiosity. Ritsuka blinked at the dress the woman was wearing. Or the lack thereof. Thin transparent silken sleeves extended past her arms and almost towards the ground, A dark orange top covered her chest and little else with 2 strips of fabric at her front and back to cover her underwear. The woman smiled at them in such a way that Ritska couldn't help but blush at the display before he snapped his eyes shut. Hardly his fault, as it looked as though they had been approached by a woman in her nightwear. "It's a lovely night, isn't it everyone?" She spoke in a soft and rather gentle tone, gesturing upwards towards the stars. "A young sweet night, although—" Her eyes fell upon Ritska and turned inquisitive. "I wonder, are you a young, bitter man?" "Good heavens, dear," Sigurd blurted out in shock. "Don't you have any clothes? It must be awfully chilly outside." He looked around before turning to Ash. "Do you have anything to give the poor woman? Dear me, she must be freezing." Ash blinked at the man. Don't get distracted now." Sigurd pointed at him. "Times such as these call for one to be diligent and dutiful. We are beset by a woman with barely enough cloth to cover her in the cold of night, and we shall make sure she is well covered." "We are. You are." Romani's voice came through, sounding slightly disappointed. "Oh." The woman instead blinked at the night before she let out a melodious giggle, covering her mouth with the back of her head. "You are indeed kind. Good night. Perhaps akin to a storybook. However, I am quite all right in such climates." She smiled at them. "I am a servant after all." Oh, Sigurd coughed. "My mistake then. Still," he trailed off, "I don't suppose I could make the case for decency?" "Most certainly you could," Kiyohime called out in support, pointing at the woman. "I can sense her home-wrecking skills from here. It must be at least B+ rank." "There's a skill for that?" Romani whispered to himself, sounding more baffled than anything else. The woman looked down at herself before looking back up. There is no need to trouble yourself," she assured the Katarinen. "It is better for me to wear less, that way I can be fast." "Fast?" Sigurd repeated with a hint of confusion. "You are all guests to this Halloween party, are you not?" the woman asked as she studied each of them, and her smile grew wider. "I'm pleased to see we have such cute ones." Flourishing herself once again with smooth movements which seemed to show off just about every curve of her body. Much to the conniptions of Kiyohime. "I am Matahari, and I am here to welcome you." She introduced herself with a dazzling smile as Ritska gave a light gulp, trying to keep his eyes from wandering. "Now then," she trailed off, halting her movements and giving a perfectly innocent expression, "I shall get things started with a dance." Whereupon she moved towards what little clothing she had left and started to undo it. "Whoa!" Ritska slapped his hands over his eyes and gasped out in shock. Mash choked on air while Sigurd coughed loudly in response. Kiyohime sputtered and looked bright red with rage. Only Ash and Fu remained straight-faced, content to simply stare at the woman with each measure of sheer bafflement. "Wow," Romani voiced aloud through the communicator. "Best Halloween party ever, we should do this more often. I realize I haven't been here to check up on their progress. How is Fujimaru Ritsu? What the hell is this?" The director's voice positively screeched over the communicator. "What in the hell made you all think it was acceptable to start watching this type of thing in the observation deck while Fujimaru is out on a mission? Are you all perverted hooligans?" "Ma'am," Carrie replied back, sounding close to laughing, "This is the mission." Put some clothes on, dear," Sigurd blurted out as he walked towards Mata while waving his hands. "You're wearing little enough as it is. Don't make your situation worse." Mata sounded genuinely surprised for a few moments. "But this is the point of the dance." "TCH." Romani clicked his tongue, moving to press the small button at the side of his monitor and shutting off the red light. Olga's eyes snapped to him at the speed of light and narrowed just as quickly. "Romani," she growled at him. "I didn't do anything. This wasn't my idea." Romani replied back while trying to look as straight-faced as possible. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 100. Halloween. IV Halloween. The Singing Pumpkin Castle, IV. So let me get this straight, Olga nursed her forehead. Eyes closed and already feeling the headache she was no doubt about to receive. You get a letter addressed to you, from a servant we all know the identity of,
telling you to come to a minute singularity only to find out it's infested with ghosts in some bizarre attempt at a holiday where you then encounter the servant known as Patches selling wares in exchange for plastic toys and candles. Kill a demon living in the forest, and then go to a castle where the servant known as Mata Hari then decided to strip down and dance for you? That's a very good summary of events, Director. Mash nodded her head vigorously while giving an innocent smile, not quite shared by the expressions of Romani and Ritska. That is what happened. I see. Olga pursed her lips, then turned her attention onto Ritska and gave him a blank stare through the hologram. And what exactly have you uncovered so far in this investigation? That Kiyohime is very good at sneaking into the ray shifts. Ritska replied earnestly, also that Patches is definitely untrustworthy, but he sells good stuff. He sells good stuff? Olga parroted back, turning to Romani with a raised eyebrow. Why yeah, Romani exclaimed, his expression turning more positive as he pulled out a list and handed it to the woman. This is what we were able to procure from him. We ray-shifted the items back and I've sent them to Leo for analysis. Olga wordlessly took the piece of paper and stared at the list with a disinterested gaze, then paused as she started to read through what they had actually managed to buy. Her eyebrows gradually rose higher and higher up her forehead while her lips parted. After she reached the bottom, her eyes darted to Romani and then back to Ritska, then to Ash. Those potions are genuine? Was the first thing she asked, the saber nodding once in affirmation. They are. Ash replied, blessings for magical energy are just as potent as those for health and equally as uncommon. Patches has a talent for acquiring a vast collection of items from both worlds, it seems. I see. Olga wet her lips, eyes darting back to the paper. Has Da Vinci reported back yet? Only to thank Fujimaru-kun for the early Christmas presents and how she'll get him something nice. He joked, then deflated when he saw the unamused expression. She says she's working on it and has deputized pharaohs into having a look at some of the items as well. Good. Olga nodded once, turning back to Ritska. Resolve this singularity and, in light of this previous purchase, I am authorizing you to make continued trade with the servant Patches, but remember to keep a cautious eye. He has demonstrated an ability to move between singularities, so we do not yet know who his master is, if he even has one. Yes, Director. Ritska replied, then paused. You aren't mad? I'm frustrated. She replied, however, in light of what you have achieved thus far in this singularity, I am willing to overlook it for the potential gains we have made. Therefore this can be filed down not as a waste of time and resources but rather as a material gathering mission within a minute disturbance. She paused, furrowing her brows, and incidentally, what is that racket? Ritska wordlessly turned the communicator around for the director to face the noise. The command room stared in silence at the bizarre display of Kiyohime chasing Mata Hari up and down the courtyard while flinging balls of fire at her. All the while Sigward, still painted up like a pumpkin, was doing his best to try and bring peace to the pair while also shouting about how Mata should cover up before she gets a cold. Fujimaru. Yes, Director. Control this mess. Olga groaned, pinching the bridge of her nose and shaking her head. Yes, Director. Ritska nodded his head, then turned to the person next to him. Ash, try and calm them down. Ash stared at him blankly. How? I don't know. I see. Ash turned back to the chaos and strode forwards without a care in the world. I shall improvise then. Ritska wasn't entirely sure what Ash meant by that, but he was certain the saber had some sort of. His line of thought trailed off when he realized that Ash probably hadn't ever made a plan in his life, and with his blunt admission that his normal strategy was basically walk towards it and hope for the best, he was now left with a morbid sense of curiosity as to what exactly the saber intended to do here. I believe this has gone on long enough. Ash spoke in a stern tone as he approached, raising his hand to signal down Kiyohime from firing off more blasts of heat. The moment he actually got close enough to the trio, Mata spied him out of the corner of her eye and instantly shifted her run towards him. Ash tensed himself for combat, only to be left dumbfounded when Mata ran right past him and then ducked behind his person, using him as some form of shield. I think you have taken this completely the wrong way. Mata argued from behind Ash, staring at Kiyohime with a casual smile.
There is no other way to take it. You traveling harlot, Kiyohime growled as she slid to a halt, pointing her fan dangerously at the pair. You tried to seduce my Anshin-sama like some homewrecker. I believe there has been some misunderstanding, Sigward managed to call out as he caught up with them, putting himself in between the cowering servant and the berserker. Let us not start fights where none exist. He gently argued in a negotiative tone. I'm sure that wasn't her intention by disrobing. I intended to seduce all of you. Mata explained with an unashamed smile, drawing looks from everyone present. That is what the dance is for. She turned to Sigward and raised an amused eyebrow. Although I suppose I should have accounted for an actual white knight being concerned over my well-being. Ah, well, Mata giggled lightly. Don't worry, I was just a little surprised is all. She turned back to Kiyohime. There really isn't a need for. You see, Kiyohime pointed at Mata accusingly, staring at Sigward with wide eyes. She just admitted to her crime. Step aside and let me deal with this wicked woman right now. If I don't, then Anshin-sama will fall into her hands and become tainted. Ash stared down at Mata. What exactly do you do? I dance. Mata explained easily enough, and I listen. I might be an assassin, but when it comes to killing, my talent is better suited to just lending an ear. An information gatherer then. Ash nodded his head, then turned back to Kiyohime before he paused and looked back down at the assassin. You were trying to seduce all of us? Yes, she replied once again with a smile. Well, I was told to provide you with an opening song and dance, but I am a little enchanting at times. Then you did not come here to fight us. He paused again, looking towards Sigward and then back at the girl. How exactly does moving your body around seduce someone? You mean dancing? Mata raised her eyebrows at him in surprise and stepped back. It's actually quite easy, she replied honestly, swaying her hips from side to side as she span on her heel in a small display. Most get rather affixed on the movements. Then you swoop in like a vulture, Kiyohime hissed. Stay away from my husband. Huh? Ritsuka's voice called out in confusion. Husband? Of course. Kiyohime replied, turning towards Ritsuka and instantly inverting her expression from a vengeful scowl into a tranquil smile. My master could never be anyone other than my husband, therefore you are my husband. I am not quite sure that marriage works like that. Sigward replied in a slow and somewhat confused tone of voice, then looked towards Ritsuka and Mash. Unless there is some cultural dissonance I am missing? Not that I know of. Ritsuka honestly replied with wide eyes as he stared at Kiyohime. I have never even had a girlfriend though. You know, Romani's voice came through the communicator. The original meaning for the Japanese word of husband is actually, one who looks after you, so it can be used for a man or a woman. He pointed out, giving Ritsuka a smile. So she can actually call her your ouch. Romani winced as the director slapped him over the back of the head. What manner of stupidity are you talking about now? He is a master, he's not going to marry his servant. She shouted at him in pure bafflement. The man rubbed the back of his head and looked over his shoulder at the woman. What? But she could, doctor. Mash stared at him through the communicator with a frown. I don't think we should be encouraging that sort of behavior. You're probably right, he admitted, slumping forwards in his chair and shaking his head. Anyway, I'm just confused. Ash stared at her, placing his hands on his hips. What was your plan after you managed to seduce us? Were you going to try and slit our throats? Oh, no, Mata shook her head. I was going to lead you inside to the deluxe house of horrors and then let you go about your business. She explained easily, I was just told to put on an opening performance and then lead you in. Nothing violent unless that was what you chose. Ash stared at Sigward, the man stared back. I might be well-traveled, but I am not quite that well-traveled. Sigward replied with a shrug, returning his attention to Matahari. So, you do not intend to fight us? I suppose I could, but it would be rather one-sided, no? It would, wouldn't it? Sigward admitted with a nod of his head, then turned to Kiyohime and raised his hands. There, no harm done. Only because I stopped her, Kiyohime asserted with a huff, flashing her fan in front of her face and narrowing her eyes over the ridge. As long as she keeps at least several meters distance from Anshin-sama at all times. Actually, my role here is done. Mata informed them, As you aren't interested in a show and a fight would be pointless, I am left with no choice but to show you the way in." She paused, then flashed a coy smile. "Unless you're interested in a dance after all?" "Well, actually, Roman, shutting up. So, you dance?" Ash tilted his head, still looking puzzled. "And do not kill people?" "Not really. The last dancer I met ripped me in half with her bare hands," Ash remarked with a troubled frown. "So, is that an exception?" "I believe so," Mata replied to him in a distant tone, her eyebrows raised up her forehead and staring at the saber in a puzzled manner, looking him up and down before she looked past him towards the direction of Ritsuka and Mash. "Don't ask," Ritsuka replied with a wave of his hands. "It's a bigger surprise if he tells you about something that didn't kill him at this point." "All right." Mata slowly started to back away, waving her hand in parting. "Then I shall give you this farewell and wish you enjoyment in the deluxe house," she replied, vanishing back into spirit form and departing the area. Assassin has retreated, Senpai," Mash reported, snapping to attention and trying to establish something approaching normality. "Yeah," Ritsuka scratched the back of his neck, blinking several times before shaking his head and dropping his arm back to his side. The boy turned towards the main entrance to the citadel and nodded towards it. "We should probably get going then." "Most certainly." Sigward gave a curious hum as he stared at the spot the assassin had been before he turned towards the others. "She seemed nice." "She's a vixen. She's supposed to look appealing," Kiyohime bluntly remarked with a scowl before her expression cooled. Regardless, to think that such a display was a custom. She paused, putting on a thoughtful face before she turned towards Ritsuka. "Do you think my wedding reception should be quiet or exciting?" "I don't know," Ritsuka replied with a shrug, dumbfounded by the question. "Get your head in the game. This is something that affects both of us." Whatever Ritsuka was going to say next was interrupted by the sound of shattering wood. The group snapped their attention towards the noise just in time to see Ash grip the door he had just punched through and rip it off its hinges and fling it across the courtyard and into the wall, shattering it in the process. Poking his head into the doorway, the saber looked left and right before he stepped back into the open and turned around. "The path is clear." Ritsuka pinched the bridge of his nose. "Why did you break the door?" "In case it was locked." "Did you check? They normally are," Ash replied, pursing his lips. "Or they open from the inside out." "I couldn't be sure, so I felt it was necessary to remove the door just in case." His head tilted slightly. "Is there an issue?" "I mean, not so much an issue as something to remember." Ritsuka shrugged his shoulders. "I mean, it did look cool," he wryly admitted with a half smile. "Just please don't do that in Chaldea, again. Or people's homes." "I will endeavor to break the doors in enemy buildings." Ash gave a single nod of the head before he turned around and marched into the fortress, brandishing both spears in his hand as he moved forwards before coming to a halt, staring at the decorum with a raised eyebrow. The others filed in after him, coming to a halt next to the saber and scanning their surroundings. "Looks nice enough," Ritsuka remarked with a surprised tone, then looked down at the flooring and winced. "We've tracked mud inside though," he lamented, raising up his shoe and staring at the dirty footprint now straining the tiles. "And from the looks of things, these floors have just been scrubbed as well." "Quite well too," Sigward complimented as he stared down at the beige and black tiles lining the ground in a chessboard pattern. "I can almost see my face in them." He chuckled merrily. "Looks rather frightful. Although I suppose that would be the war paint," he remarked with another light chuckle. Mash stared at the ground, staring at the flooring with narrowed eyes before she looked up at the others. "But who cleaned the floors?" she asked with a curious expression, looking around at the assembled group. "Because the singularity is rather recent and the floors look like they have been waxed." "You think there's castle servants here?" Romani asked through the communicator with surprise. "It's possible, but this castle should only just have arrived today. That would mean that whatever staff are here were linked to the summoning of this building as well." "So some sort of familiar?" Ritsuka asked, looking at the screen. "You said those did things for you, right?" Olga paused, cupping her chin and nodding her head, a sensible suggestion. "The skeletons you encountered could also function as familiars for a caster, although having them mop floors is certainly a use I wouldn't have thought they would be used for." She paused, then shook her head.
regardless of that, continue on with caution. The rapid construction of a fortress such as this is either the product of a noble phantasm or, she paused, rubbing her brow, a holy grail.
Another one? Ritska blurted out in surprise. A holy grail is nothing more than calcified magical energy. Romani replied. The amount of magical energy produced by a singularity could be turned into a holy grail and, at which point, it becomes a very powerful battery for servants. Terrific. Ritska groaned, shaking his head and looking down the hallways, paying attention to the doors lining each side which no doubt led to other rooms in the fortress. So we might be dealing with either a holy grail or a noble phantasm. Probably the former actually, considering it's Liz. He looked back at the doctor and gestured over his shoulder with a thumb. It would explain all the decorations.
It would, wouldn't it? Romani blinked in surprise. The process of transmuting magical energy into decorations isn't impossible. I mean, it's something that no magus would ever do, but it's something that someone could do.
Because it would be an utter waste of time. Olga frowned. Using gradation air in such a baffling manner would be considered the height of stupidity. Either that or they have merely bypassed the steps used in the making of plastic and growing of pumpkins. She waved her hand. The utilization of skeleton familiars is less complicated for a knowledgeable necromancer. Then we have more reason to see this singularity through to the end. Ash affirmed to himself, moving towards the closest door on the left and raising his leg up before kicking the door in, shattering the frames and splintering the wood into fragments inside the room. This was a bedroom. Empty, he informed the others. Ash? Yes? Element of surprise. Ritska informed him with a strained smile, we still need it.
I see. Ash paused mid-kick, lowering the leg to the ground and slotting the long spear onto the holder mounted on his back, then twisted the door handle before pushing it open. Empty, he called out after taking a single look inside the room and closing the door again.
Door-to-door search. Ritska waved to the others. Let me know if you see anything. He stared down the hallway. We've only got one direction we can do. May as well remove the chance of being ambushed, right? Ambush? Ash paused before he shook his head, turning to Ritska and pushing open another door. Our senses work well enough that we should at least sense a disturbance before.
A large spider instantly tackled him to the ground. Large fangs sunk into his shoulder and caused the saber to gasp out in surprise as he then started to wrestle with it. The others stood transfixed by the display before a thud echoed throughout the hallway.
Senpai! Mash cried out in surprise at seeing the master lying flat on his back with his eyes rolled into the back of his skull, once again having passed out the second after seeing the familiar arachnid jump out at someone. Oh crap, Romani blurted out. Those are the same spiders from Rome. Ash released a grunt as he clasped the head of the spider and let loose a burst of flame into the arachnid's face. The creature recoiled while screaming in a hissing wail. Ash pulled his leg back underneath it before kicking upwards and throwing the beast off his body. He quickly scrambled to his feet while raising the short spear in his hands and spinning it around before thrusting it downwards into the soft underbelly. The spear crunched through the body and stabbed into the tiles, cracking them as he nailed the creature to the ground and stepped away from it. The spiked legs thrashed around for a few moments before they curled inwards and went still. Ash exhaled, turning towards the door where the spider had jumped out off and glaring at the now empty room before he turned his head up. Webs lined the ceiling along with what looked like the remains of a cow. I believe we have been ambushed. Ash informed the others, turning around and finding them already fretting over the passed-out master. Ah, yes. He then remembered the previous encounter, fear of spiders. The group paused as a chittering sound, followed by rapid thuds against a solid surface. They slowly turned around to see the direction the chitterings were coming from. The chitterings grow louder, followed by a crack and a sprinkling of dust raining down from the ceiling. Ash stared at the pile of dust on the ground before his eyes slowly turned upwards, soon followed by everyone else. Dozens, if not hundreds, of spiders of various sizes clung to the ceiling, all using their spear-like legs to stab into the ceiling and wander across it, their mandibles clicking to make a series of rapid noises as they paused. Pupilless orbed eyes stared down at the group. fangs rubbed together producing a rasping noise like metal being rubbed against metal. Do haunted houses normally have this sort of thing? Mash asked in a quiet, somewhat shaky voice as she slowly moved to protect Ritska, bringing her cross shield up in front of the boy and hooking an arm just underneath him. Spiders, Romani voiced back in a squeaky tone. Yeah, it's normally a given. I see. Ash started to step backwards, ripping the spear out of the dead spider at his feet and slowly unholstering the longer one on his back. I was unaware they were usually this dangerous. They normally aren't that big. The caster from Rome? Maybe. Romani admitted quietly, but they are an existence established in the world in the same manner as wyverns and the like, so probably summoned here as well. We are going to have to fight through them. Sigwart rumbled, grasping his greatsword with both hands and tensing himself. Mash, Kiyohime. Keep Master Ritska safe. Naturally. Kiyohime replied almost instantly, scooting closer to Ritska's unconscious body and closing up her fan. Opting to glare at the spiders as they moved closer and closer. And to scare my husband into such a state. I shall be the dutiful wife and bring comfort back to him. She growled menacingly, a wisp of hot air emanating from between her teeth. Ash wordlessly returned his twin spears to his bottomless box, replacing it with the large double-sided Great AXE from a Black Knight's arsenal. Reaching in for a second time, he took out the helm of a cathedral knight and placed it atop his head, fitting it and grasping the large two-handed weapon with both hands and leaning forwards in preparation. The spiders on the ceiling released a hiss before they dropped down to the ground, scurrying towards the servants in a frantic charge. Grunts of exertion echoed through the hallways, intermittent with wet splats and annoyed groans. You're not getting in there. A male voice rang out, sounding mildly irritated. You have to put your back into it. You put your back into it, a female voice snapped back. It's a tough stain and it's not coming out. Besides, we wouldn't be here if your pets could actually clean properly. They waxed the floors, the man snapped back, crossing his arms and glaring at the woman. Have you ever tried to teach a spider how to wax a floor? Of course you haven't. So do not presume to comment to me on matters which you have no knowledge of. You've never cleaned a day in your life either. The woman stood up, turning around and sneering at the man. So how would you know whether I'm putting my back into it enough or not? Well, that's what I overheard my servants saying. The man explained after a moment's pause. I assumed they knew more of cleaning than I did. Another paused, before they died anyway. Before you killed them. As if you were one to talk, bloodsucker. Seldora scoffed, crossing his arms and glaring at the woman before his eyes turned upwards and he scowled. You're putting holes in the ceiling. The spider paused what it was doing, slowly turning its head to stare down at the pair and chittering back before turning away and crawling along the length of the ceiling and towards the walls before it scurried downwards and back through the hallways. What could possibly have possessed that half-wit that the pair of us would make for good cleaners? Seldora scowled, stomping his foot and glaring at the floor. I'm a duke and you're a countess. We've never had to do a manual day's work in our lives. Unlike you, I actually did put in the effort. Carmilla responded back with a roll of her eyes behind her mask, returning to glaring at the stain on the tile. I enjoyed getting invested in my work. Bloodletting, if your legend is to be believed. You fed your people to spiders, don't try to play a moral card with me. Carmilla dryly responded before scowling again and grabbing the bucket of lukewarm water and once again dousing a rag with the liquid and attempting to scrub the stain out again. I wasn't trying to. Seldora responded easily. Besides, it was quite a fascinating experience, I shall have you know. His tone becoming more clinical. I had already seen the manner in which the spiders had killed simple cattle, but I wanted to know how they would interact with much more evolved prey. As it turns out, rather well. They even started bringing souls to my dear Phrygia for some odd reason. He paused, sniffing to himself. Shame I never figured out why. He stared back at the stain and frowned. That isn't coming out, is it? Carmilla let out an annoyed growl. Obviously. That stupid girl just did this to spite me. Throwing a tantrum because she can't accept reality. Isn't she you? An embarrassing truth to be sure, but one she seems determined to reject. Carmilla grunted in response, scrubbing harder at the surface. And quite frankly, she's as embarrassing to me as I no doubt am to her. prancing around and screeching with that dreadful voice of hers. Seldora paused, furrowing his brows. She can't sing? Oh no, she can sing very well. The woman grinned viciously. It just so happens that she is singing for herself and taps into her dragonic nature, leading to the rather unfortunate situation of her roaring like a beast. She paused, then looked at Seldora. I half expect she's got an inkling of why that is at any rate. Fine, she hates you, Seldora admitted, then pointed at himself with a scowl. But why have I been dragged into this mess? She's fixated on Halloween and you breed an army of spiders. That is it. She scoffed, vigorously scrubbing at the stain on the floor before she returned to her feet and hurled the wet rag at the patch of filth in irritation. Why can't this stupid thing just vanish? I swear it was easier cleaning out bloodstains than it was cleaning this. I'll summon some more spiders. Seldora sighed, looking down the hallway. At the very least they can bring some. The pair paused at the loud crash coming from the door at the end of the corridor which led to the entrance. The two raised an eyebrow with Carmilla letting out an annoyed sigh. Why on earth must those fireworks be so loud? It's as if someone is attacking the place. She turned to Seldora. Or one of your little bugs has gotten clumsy. Arachnids. Seldora corrected with a strained smile. Not bugs. Arachnids. I explain this to you every time. And I tell you that insects aren't interesting to me. Seldora's strained smile vanished into a scowl. You're doing this on purpose, are you not? Whatever could you possibly? The twin doors burst open, the pair jolted in surprise as an entire group of people came barreling into the hallway. A girl in knight armor with a large shield dragging an unconscious young man in a white shirt and black trousers were the first through the door. The girl not even noticing the pair of servants barely 5 meters from her as she rushed into the hallway. They were then followed by a teal-haired girl in a light blue kimono charging in after them while flinging fire over her shoulder at something unseen and was rewarded with a pained hiss. The next individual was somewhat more intimidating. Dark leather armor with a white fur collar around the shoulders leading into a dark blue cape wielding a black twin-bladed axe and a closed helmet while covered head to toe in green blood. Then he was followed by a small white animal-like creature which didn't look natural. And finally, a walking pumpkin. The two armored figures turned around and slammed the door closed. Was that all of them, Sigward-san? The pink-haired girl asked, breathing heavily and still cradling the passed-out boy in her arms. I believe so. The pumpkin, Sigward, responded in an exhausted voice. But let's keep this door closed just in case. Did you see any, Ash? No, the cloaked knight responded in a strained voice. I did not, but there was a great confusion in our advance. He leaned away from the door and turned around. For now we should. He cut himself off as he found himself staring at the pair of servants in the hallway. The others noticed the silence and looked in the direction that Ash was staring, only to similarly tense up at the sight of the other two servants in the hallway staring at them with surprised expressions. Dead silence permeated between the two groups as they stared at each other, soon offset by gentle tappings as a door opened up behind the two servants. A large spider came out with one leg raised up and bent in such a way to be able to carry a metal bucket on the limb and not have it spill. The attention of the new arrivals fell onto the spider with the bucket. The arachnid paused at the sight of the servants. Okay guys, the readings are saying there are new servants here, so be ready for. Is that spider holding a bucket? A face flashed up on a blue screen before it turned baffled, staring at the creature with confusion. You just ruined the hallway. Didn't you? Seldora was the first to speak in an irritated tone of voice as he scanned the group, noting the smears of green blood on their bodies. And you killed all the spiders, didn't you? Have you the slightest notion how long it took to teach them how to wax the floors? He growled at them. You mudslinging peasants. Luddite commoners, swineherders. The spiders waxed the floors? The transparent blue man spoke again in clear surprise. Wow, they did a really good job of that too. That would explain why they were in the castle. Be silent, you jester. Celodra snapped at him. Your compliments are worthless when you have quite clearly just brutalized the cleaning staff. Cleaning staff? Ash voiced out in slight confusion. Not by choice. Carmilla growled out in annoyance, then turned around to the spider still holding the bucket. What are you waiting for, bug? She snapped at the spider. The creatures jolted before it walked forwards and dropped the cleaning liquid in front of her before it scurried away. "I'm not cleaning up the remains of your pets," she then told Seldora as she crouched down, grabbing the rag off the floor and dunking it into the fresh cleaning liquid and rinsing it out before wiping down the stain. Her expression turned triumphant as she watched the stain virtually vanish after several solid scrubs of the rag. HMPH. Sigurd raised his hand. "So you mean to suggest the spiders were the cleaning staff?" "Yes." Seldora sighed, giving the knight an annoyed look. "What of it?"
Why did they attack us? Probably because you all traipsed mud in here just after we finished cleaning the floors. Carmilla pointed at them. Have commoners lost any sort of respect when it comes to audiences with the noble class? At the very least you could have cleaned yourselves up.
Ash was looking between the two of them repeatedly. "Did we not meet previously?" Carmilla furrowed her brows as she stared at them. "If we did meet in a previous summoning, then I cannot recall it clearly. Some vague feeling of annoyance when I stare at you." Seldora hummed in agreement with the vampire, staring at the four, then noticing Ritska. What is the matter with him? He was rewarded with silence. TCH. No respect these days. He clicked his tongue at them, shaking his head and looking away and towards Carmilla before pausing. "Countess Carmilla." He called out to her in a more casual tone. "A word." He beckoned her over as the pair stepped back and started to whisper to each other. "What are we going to do?" Mash asked. "Senpei is still unconscious." "The way I see it, we need to advance." Ash responded in a low tone as he stared at the pair of nobles. "Either they step aside or we simply fight through them." "I concur." Kiyohime nodded her head in response. "The sooner that Enshin-sama is out of danger, the better. Especially if it puts him far away from something that might frighten him like these filthy insects." "Arachnids." Seldora corrected her in an irritated tone before going back to whispering with Carmilla. "Whatever." Kiyohime huffed. "My point stands. She does raise a good point," Sigurd quietly admitted. "And neither of these chaps are the friendly sort, but we might be able to convince them to stand aside." He pondered aloud, scratching his chin. "I'm sure they can be reasoned with if we approach them casually." Mash gave him a dubious look before she stared at Carmilla and Seldora before returning her attention to Sigurd. "You think so?" "Everyone can be reasoned with," Sigurd affirmed. "I think so at least. It's just a matter of speaking the language." "You want to try and exchange words with them?" Ash stared at him with raised eyebrows behind his helmet, then turned towards the pair again. "You mean how you were going to try and exchange words with a chaos demon?" "I'm sure I could have talked some sense into him," Sigurd affirmed to himself. "You talked sense into a giant, didn't you?" "Because the giant was reasonable," Ash replied as if the answer was obvious. "The moment the chaos demon caught sight of either of us, it tried to cut us in half. I'm sure we just startled them. They were camped in the middle of a road leading towards a collection of houses. Why would it be surprised about undead being in a town full of undead? You never know." Sigurd shook his head. "Anyway, I'm certain that these two are just as reasonable. We have come up with a proposition for you," Seldora called out to the group, bringing their attention over to him. "Which we believe to be fair and acceptable." "See?" Sigurd pointed at them, sounding rather pleased. "Reasonable. We're going to put you into indentured servitude," Seldora informed them, "where you will be working for us. Naturally your first job will be to clean this place from top to bottom," Carmilla added on with a smirk. "While we enjoy our much-deserved rest and allow the cleaning to be done by those better suited to the task, namely yourselves. This is the proposition," Seldora finished. "You either allow us to clamp you in irons and work as servants, or you can resist, after which we will beat you and then clamp you in irons and turn you into servants." He shrugged. "The only real difference is whether or not you have to endure pain first." Ash silently turned his head to stare at Sigurd. "All right." The pumpkin knight slumped his shoulders. "Maybe not so reasonable. One thing I am curious about." Carmilla pointed a clawed fingernail at Sigurd. "Why are you dressed like a vegetable?" "I just painted my armor to be festive," Sigurd replied with a shrug. "I've been told it's rather amusing." "I see." Carmilla pursed her lips in response, giving him a dismissive wave of the hand. No matter. You can either accept our terms or be beaten into submission. Was this not your responsibility? Kiyohime asked with narrowed eyes, pointing at the bucket. I realize not everyone can have my A+++ cleaning skills, but that is no excuse to shirk from your duties. A+++ cleaning? Seldora raised an eyebrow in confusion. That can't be a real skill. I agree, Kiyohime-san. Mash turned to her with a baffled expression. That skill doesn't sound real. Of course it's real. Kiyohime confidently boasted with a triumphant smile. I can clean burnable trash and non-burnable trash with my flames. What is that if not cleaning? Arson. Romani bluntly replied through the communicator. Improper disposal of rubbish. Quiet, you. Kiyohime scowled at the doctor. It's cleaning. Throwing around flames doesn't make you a cleaner. Carmilla frowned. It makes you a vandal. Nonsense. What do you mean, nonsense? It's common sense. Carmilla looked past them, pointing at the girl. Would anyone clean by hurling a ball of fire at the general direction of the garbage? Well, it depends what I am cleaning. Ash shrugged, but I normally throw balls of fire at my enemies. Naturally. Carmilla remarked looking back at the girl. See? The first thing that's going to happen is you're going to learn how to actually clean up. Wah, how dare. I know everything there is to know about cleaning up. Kiyohime growled. I am a dutiful wife and as such, there is no home life habit that is beyond my person. What the? Ritsuka groaned, his eyes blinking open. Wah, what happened? Spiders. Ash replied before anyone else could try and stop him. Oh, right. Ritsuka closed his eyes again. Are they gone? Yes. Oh good. Ritsuka sighed in relief. Mash helping him back to his feet. What's going on? He asked, looking around then pausing as he found himself staring at Carmilla and Seldora. Wait a moment, haven't we met before? Again, vague feelings of irritation. Carmilla responded. Now, your answer? My answer. Ritsuka replied with a puzzled expression. To what? Becoming our servants by choice so that you can clean up the mess you made or being beaten into it. Right, no. Ritsuka shook his head. I'm not doing that. Well then. Carmilla manifested her staff while Seldora narrowed his eyes. The entertaining way it is. She smirked. I still have a duty aside from cleaning to welcome guests to this bloodhouse of horror and I can see no better way of doing that than by fulfilling the blood aspect of it. Why is it always blood with you? Seldora asked with an irritated frown. Because I'm a vampire. What's your excuse with all the spiders? Because they're interesting. So, we're fighting then? Ritsuka asked the others. At their nods he gave a small noise of understanding. All right then. Well, no reason to kill them over mopping floors. He replied, rubbing the back of his neck. Wait, have you two killed anyone so far? No, the pair responded back, both looking rather annoyed. Carmilla carried on. That infernal girl has us trapped here as servants in the literal sense as well as that magical sense. Forced to clean up this castle, what a joke. What did the Grail have to be a thing that exists? So she does have the Holy Grail then? Ritsuka nodded to himself. That answers that. So she summoned you as staff then? Yes, fortunately, we are about to be freed from that predicament. Carmilla smirked, waving her staff towards them. As you have so graciously volunteered yourselves to our service and even if you didn't, well, it is the way of the world that commoners serve at the behest of nobles. That's barely even a thing anymore. It's the 1600s. Carmilla responded with a bland look. It is still very much the thing here. Fair enough. Ritsuka sighed, stepping behind Mash and the others. You can fight them now. I'm certain they'll be along soon. The blond man spoke as he continued to weave the thread together. Sat in his chair in the corner of the room near a fireplace. I believe they had the feeling of being a punctual sort. The figure opposite him merely hummed in response as they watched him work. Thou art rather skilled at that, art thee not? A man can be afforded his pastimes. The pale-skinned man chuckled in response, finding the question more amusing than offensive. Besides, thinking of the needles as small stakes aids me in the process of commanding the threads to bow to my will. I sense a great spirit buried within this guise of yours. The being muttered, tilting their head, the heart of a proud monarch who protects their people, perhaps. Vlad hummed in response as he continued to knit away, and I confess that it is peculiar, pardon me if I cause offense, to find the heart of a rather honorable figure in such a strange form.
Thy question is not one of offense, therefore I take none in kind. The Rat King dismissed his concerns, sitting upon the leather chair not facing the fire and staring at the vampire. We rats hold true to our words, and as their king, this goes doubly so for myself. 'Tis why I find my summoning here for such a ghastly reason an insult.
An insult from a young girl who knows no better, despite the fact she should. Vlad argued back with a sigh. She is indeed a troubled one, and considering that she seeks to break free of her established self, I suppose she can be afforded her moments of humor.
Thee cares for the girl. I suppose I can empathize in part for the strength of a legend I do not like. Vlad wryly responded, gesturing to himself, I was not this beast in life. This creature which seeks the blood of the living. I was a proud king who fought to protect my people and my faith from invaders, and my legend was forever tainted by populist legends about me.
The Rat King hummed in response, staring straight ahead. 'Tis a great shame that a proud figure might fall so far, but we rats understand that all too dearly. Our great kingdoms fell to the greed and fear of men and left us with naught but our treasured burrows, even that could not be afforded peace from invaders. The work of a king is never easy, Vlad wryly replied, resting his hands on his lap and staring at the fire. And often unforgiving. He paused. What manner of pastimes did you indulge yourself in? I believe the human term for it is theater. Plays? Vlad blinked in surprise before giving a nod soon after. Your voice does contain a certain gravitas to it. Such things were not as common as they used to be in our great city of Jarden, but I would take up the role on occasion. The rat admitted with a nostalgic tone. 'Tis one of the many ventures I have not participated in for some time. A pity. Vlad remarked with a frown. Still, I would very much like to see such a performance starring yourself. If I am not being rude, I believe it would be quite the performance. For the matter of my race, no doubt. The Rat King snorted in amusement. 'Tis not something to take offense to. Indeed, I find the idea that humans could put on performances to tug at the strings of a heart most novel as well. A sense of equal bafflement between our two races. Bafflement indeed. Vlad chuckled as he resumed knitting. How goes the effort to avoid the cat? The Rat King shivered slightly. There is some fitting cruelty at work that a being who radiates the curse of the sun might also bear the marks of our greatest hunters. The world is nothing if not cruel at times. Vlad sighed morosely, and she is a berserker. As art thou. The Rat King pointed out. A frightful place this is. I see. The shadowed figure spoke in a deep tone. They have gotten past Mata Hari and are now facing Carmilla and the spider guy. He's a duke. The other figure remarked as they set a tray down on the table, then paused before adjusting it with large furred hands. But yes, they've gotten that far and are going to fight him. They paused. I was more surprised they were using spiders to clean the floors. I didn't even know they could do that. The first figure responded with obvious surprise. Did you see them scurrying around with small brooms clasped in their teeth and using rags to wipe up the floor? She snickered. It was rather amusing. She paused. Anyway, how goes their suffering? They walked right past Mata. Although apparently the master did pass out when they saw a spider. The second figure added on. Turns out they have a fear of them. That's good. The first figure cheered excitedly. Excellent. That's the sort of stuff I want to see. Arachnophobia? Huh? No. Suffering. Fear. A sense of dread? They cried out, waving the small pitchfork in their hand. Mawahahaha. Suffer more, despair more. Lose all hope in this banquet of blood. There isn't any blood. You said no to the blood puddings. Of course I did. Beef blood? Pig blood? If you're going to put blood in your food, then don't be a coward and put in the proper stuff. And you wonder how you became a vampire. The second figure muttered out under their breath. What was that? Nothing. They replied with a sigh, then turned away from the first figure. Anyway, I'm positive that the best thing to do is to wait. They'll be along after Carmilla, probably. She's better at fighting than cleaning anyway. Of course, that bloodsucker can't do anything right. So you can clean floors, can you? Why would I even do that? I'm an Edo Ahem. I mean I'm an evil witch. I have minions to do that sort of thing for me. Uh-huh. What's with that doubtful tone? Why am I arguing about this with you anyway? They sighed. Just, go back to your duties. Yes, master. Namu Amida Butsu. En Namu, what? It's a fancy phrase in Japan. I use it to mean, please forgive my brutality and depravity, for I am not but a brutish beast. You're pretty knowledgeable sometimes, you know, the first figure replied with a hint of awe in their tone before they shook their head. Anyway, I will ensure the final preparations of my banquet are completed. If they do get past that bloodsucker, there is still Vlad and the rat. MMMMMMH. Rat. Don't. Stop trying to eat them. The first figure growled at them. Stop trying to chase them too. I know you look a bit like a beats, but there's no reason for you to act like one at times too. But being a berserker is the one thing that lets me chase them. The second figure whined. It means they don't have a class advantage over me. A what? Never mind. Just don't chase them. Fine. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.